tank. And of course, our panellists are still with us. Lieutenant Colonel, if I can just ask you, do you think the US is going to have to eventually change position and supply fighter jets?
Well, you certainly can't rule that out. And based on how many other, hard red lines that we wouldn't cross earlier in the war, almost all of which we have crossed, I mean, it would almost be illogical not to at some point. But I think that people need to be sober on what this aircraft can actually do in the time frame that we're talking about, because fighting with an F-16 is a very highly technical endeavor that you have to have a lot of experience with. And yes, there are some fighter pilots in Ukraine right now, and then they could be cross-trained over to the F-16. But even for a U.S. fighter pilot, somebody who's already been trained on fighting, they have to go through 37 weeks just for the F-16 itself. And this is not just an analogous to a MiG-29, for example, that Ukraine has in its current inventory. And it's going to take a long time to just get basic capabilities. But to be able to fight, enemy air-to-air combat, or to be able to defend against the S-400 anti-aircraft systems that the Russians have, we need to understand this is not a wonder weapon, and it can be shot out of the sky as well as the MiG-29s and the Su-25s that Ukraine has been fighting with.
What is the logic of the US or European nations saying they will supply certain defensive weapons and tanks now, but not supply planes? Obviously, everyone is aware of the risk of escalation and of an unpredictable Russian response.
Well, I mean, you hit it square on the head there. That's exactly the issue, is the unpredictable nature of where the red line really is. I mean, I know what Russia has said before and what we were concerned about, and it seems like the NATO alliance and the United States has been inching forward over the last 11 months to find out, okay, well, I guess this isn't a red line. I guess this isn't a red line. And the problem is we don't know where the real red line is. And at some point we could cross a line known only to Putin, and things could get really dicey for the NATO alliance and the United States in particular.
It's a danger, though, that, as we saw with Afghanistan, with Syria, that this sort of mission goes on for a very long time. A lot of lives are lost on both sides. The global economic damage continues, and no side is victorious. I mean, without more power, Zelensky is saying he needs 300 tanks, and he's calling for planes.
Yeah, I mean, that's what he's calling for. And it would take actually a lot more than that, I think, to really mount a viable counteroffensive, especially, if you're even thinking about this summer or spring. And that's one of the things I've been really talking about since the beginning, to include with all of the, whether it was the Abrams or the Challenger or the Leopard tanks from Germany, the Marder personnel carriers, the U.S. Bradley. There's a lot of vehicles that we're talking about putting on there, but building combat power is a real problem. And just like this aircraft, I think there's this mentality that people think that NATO equipment equals NATO capability, and that Ukraine, if they just get it, will be able to do the same thing a NATO army could. And I'm telling you, they're going to be in for a big disappointment, because the reason why NATO is successful is because of the crew and the soldiers that man that equipment, that are very well trained and have, whole careers of people at the various levels to make it so. You can't just replicate that by putting tanks and airplanes on the ground like that we use.
Lieutenant, do stay with us if you can. And I just want to bring in Mo Lethi. I mean, from the political perspective, President Biden being clear at the moment on not supplying fighter jets, do you think that position could shift, could be open to change?
I'd agree with everything that was just said, in terms of, we have seen time and time again that the president has drawn a red line. And at the moment that the United States and his military advisors felt that it was advisable, they went ahead and crossed their own red line in terms of passing along equipment. Some of this may also be a negotiating tactic with our allies. Germany was being very reluctant to go alone in providing tanks. The United States was reluctant to send tanks, in part for many of the same reasons that was just discussed. Our tanks didn't maybe work as well on this terrain as the German tanks did. But eventually, through the negotiation and agreeing to send some, we were able to get the equipment from Germany that needed to get there. So I think there's a lot of things at play here. But I'm with the Lieutenant Colonel. This is not. We should not be ruling any eventuality out.
Rebecca Harding, I mean, we have seen the huge sort of economic impact of Ukraine. When you travel to parts of the world that are not in Europe, there is a different perspective and a different view as to how the Western allies should act here. What is your sense on this? Is there a fear about Western escalation in support for Ukraine?
Absolutely, and I think the biggest thing here, and you can see that the US is actually trying to strengthen relationships in the Indo-Pacific as well, specifically with Japan and South Korea. I think the most important thing here in everything that has been done over the last 12 months is actually to hold NATO together. And I think quite apart from the military angle to all of this, and the comments that have been made so far are absolutely right about the levels of training, there's going to be a heated debate on whatever the next steps are going to be, because there's a huge risk of miscalculation. For as long as Putin and Russia have 6,000 nuclear warheads, there is a threat there, even if we think it's bluff, there is still a threat there. And the risks of calling that bluff are too high. They're incalculable. So they mean loss of human life. So what we have to do is make sure that everybody is in lockstep together. Because the other thing is that if we aren't in lockstep together, then we're actually playing directly into Russian hands. Russia did not anticipate NATO holding together as well as it did, and as well as it has done over the last year. The economic sanctions, the export controls, all of those have held together. They've all been done in lockstep. And any decision in the future on whether or not to send more tanks or to send jets or ships or whatever has to be done in agreement with the whole group of allies.
Lieutenant Colonel Daniel Davis, I mean, at what point is this effectively NATO against Russia? And what does victory look like?
Well, that really is the most important question, that last one there. What does victory look like? And that's one of my complaints about what we've been doing over the last 11 months and this incremental, parceling out of different kinds of capabilities, that it doesn't appear that there's a real clear idea of what we want to even accomplish. Because if the answer is whatever Zelensky says, which is driving Russia completely out of all Ukraine territory back to the 1991 borders, that means all of Crimea. And look, I mean, like your last guest just said there, that the chances of nuclear escalation, if Ukraine even starts to make military progress towards driving Russia out back into Crimea because of NATO equipment and NATO support, then the chance of escalation goes way up, and the probability of using tactical nuclear weapons, I think, is very high. And so we have to be clear on what is realistic and what we want to accomplish before we just keep giving pieces out here and there. And the last thing that I would point out is that we have to recognize that there are different rules when you're talking about a nuclear superpower. This is not like Saddam Hussein or Muammar Gaddafi or Bashar al-Assad, where you can almost do anything you want and they can't do anything in response. This has different rules, and we have to come to recognition that the nuclear threshold could be crossed if we don't play our cards very, very wisely.
Lieutenant Colonel Daniel L. Davis, thank you very much indeed for your time today.